Hello guys, I'm André Miceli and this is Eles. I'm with Professor Sinan Aral. He is the director of the initiative on the digital economy and the author of the Hype Machine. Professor, welcome. Let's start from the beginning, the title of your book. What is the Hype Machine?
So the Hype Machine is the social media industrial complex. It is the grouping of technologies and businesses and platforms that make up the social media ecosystem that has been completely overturning our world in the last decade, from elections and democracy to public health, coronavirus and measles, all the way to businesses, changing how businesses market, affecting the stock markets, and so on.
Well, cool. When you say how those things spread over the world, of course we have to think about the main challenges of our society today, which is dealing with misinformation and fake news. One of your studies says that fake news spreads more quickly than truth. So in what stances does fake news spread more quickly than real news, and why does it happen?
Great question. So in 2018, we published the largest ever longitudinal study of the spread of fake news online on the cover of Science. And this study, which we did with Twitter, showed that fake news traveled further, faster, deeper, more broadly than the truth in every category of information that we studied, and specifically in political information. Sometimes 6 times faster than the truth. And why does it happen is a very interesting question. So we first thought, well, maybe it has something to do with the spreaders of false information. Maybe they have more followers, or maybe they follow more people, or maybe they're more often verified users of Twitter or have been on Twitter longer. And when we checked each one of these in turn, we found that the opposite was true, that false news spreaders had fewer followers, followed fewer people, were less often verified, had been on Twitter for less time, and so on. So we had to come up with another explanation. And we looked at the novelty of the information in false news and the degree to which people were surprised and some sort of emotional response was elicited from false news. And what we found when we examined the information content of false news was that it was way more novel than true news. It was things that you hadn't heard before. And when we looked at the replies to true and false news tweets, we found that people expressed surprise significantly more often in reply to false news than true news. They also expressed anger and disgust. In reply to true news, they expressed anticipation, joy, and trust. And so this anger eliciting feeling of disgust and being completely surprised by fake news is correlated with people's greater likelihood of sharing it with others. And this is what we call the novelty hypothesis. So it certainly relates to the social network because this is the substrate, as I describe in my book, on which all of this information spreads. It certainly has to do with the algorithms because the algorithms are designed to support a business model that favors engagement. And the reason for that is because the more engaged more users are, the greater attention Facebook, Twitter, and others can garner, the more opportunities they have to sell ads, which is their entire business model. Now, it also, however, is not solely because of technology. What we found in the study was that when we took, for instance, bots out of the study and put them back in, that it could not explain why fake news traveled so much farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth, and that human beings were an essential element of this process of the spread of falsity. So we can't abdicate the responsibility for dealing with fake news because we as human beings are a big part of the problem.
when you mention the business model, and I do agree with it, it is kind of easy to see the responsibility of these social networks to fight against fake news somehow. It is especially difficult to understand that algorithms can easily find and identify this kind of news. But how can these companies help society to fight against fake news?
Great question. So I think in answer to the first part of your question, I think the true leaders of the new social age, as I call it, are going to be the business leaders that realize that the health and safety of this ecosystem is actually aligned with their long-term profit motive. Even if one thinks that in the short term, you can make money off of disgusting and anger-provoking and hatred-filled speech in an ecosystem like this, that kind of pollution will eventually ruin the long-term potential of the ecosystem because no one will want to use it. And so I think that the business leaders that realize that the long-term profit motive that they hold and the health of this ecosystem are aligned will start to address these types of measures. Now, in my book, The Hype Machine, I describe many different things that we can do to address misinformation, including the technological solutions, like you mentioned, changing the algorithms, building fake news detecting algorithms that are more and more successful, but also some other very simple things that can be done. So, for instance, labeling is a great example. When we go to the store to buy food to eat, it is extensively labeled. We know how many calories it has, how many trans fats it has, how much sodium, how much sugar. But when we consume information, we have none of these labels about what's contained in this information. Is it true or false? How often does this source provide true or false information? What is the provenance of this information? How many independent sources did this article use to fact check the information that it's providing, and so on. This type of labeling and transparency can go a long way to help consumers decide which information to consume and believe and which information to share with their friends. We also need digital media literacy, to programs in our schools that are going to educate the next generation about the critical thinking skills that are required to, for their own selves, root out misinformation. So I think a very large fraction of the misinformation that spreads online can be easily fact-checked by a single Google search. So if everyone on the planet were to do a Google search on an article before they shared it with their friends, they would probably find in the first few links that it was either debunked or that it was true. And if they then decided not to share those that were debunked, then that would go a long way to stemming misinformation. But we don't do that now. We are either lazy or we don't care enough, and we share the information without checking it for ourselves first.
Now I'll change the topic to the business side. And for a long time, companies have worked with a logic that they had to differentiate their products and services using any kind of attributes, price, quality, or anything like that. Then they had to communicate this advantage to the market, and then they worked around it. Today, with the influence of social networks, can they change this logic? Has influence become more important than quality?
Well, I wouldn't say that quality is unimportant, but social media has completely changed the landscape of consumer engagement. So in my book, I describe 4 decades of consumer engagement that were originally described by Rob Kane, the former CIO of Coca-Cola. And he said there have been the 4 last decades can be characterized like this. In the 1980s, we were thinking about a single message that would go over a single channel to the entire population. Think about a television commercial that would happen during the World Cup or during a big soccer match, okay? In the 1990s, we were thinking about segmentation. Well, maybe there's a difference between 18 to 24-year-old video game enthusiasts and 30 to 40-year-old soccer moms, and we can think of these as different audiences and create different messages for these different segments of the population. In the 2000s, with the advent of the internet, was the rise of personalization and customization, where we could target individual messages at people based on their demographics and their behaviors, like what websites they've visited. But since 2010, we've been really living in the era of the socially linked consumer, where everyone's perceptions of brands and businesses are mediated by their digital social networks and social media. And what this means, if you think about this as an evolution over 4 decades, is that if your brand is still thinking about market segmentation, you're about 3 decades behind. My book describes exactly how this new social age, as I call it, is transforming and revolutionizing business and tactics and strategies that are necessary to succeed in this new environment.
Still talking about business and still talking about truth, is it possible to say that all these things about misinformation and fake news happen in rating products and services online? Do we have to fight against fake reviews in the same way that we have to fight against fake news in general?
Absolutely. So the elements of the new social age and the effect of the hype machine of social media on business and brands and commerce pervades all aspects of a consumer's understanding of the marketplace, including the review process. And I have an entire chapter devoted to what I call the wisdom or the madness of crowds, which is about the user-generated content and crowdsourced opinions about products and services, but also about many other things like political candidates and many other things online. And the same types of biases and pathologies that apply to social media apply to social rating systems. We've done numerous experiments that describe herding bias and social influence bias and why we have a J shape of ratings. So if you think about the rating, 5-star ratings, okay? If you sampled the population of people who had consumed a product, a hotel, a restaurant, or a sneaker, you would expect a normal distribution of experiences. Most of the people's experience would be average. There would be some small percentage that had a fantastic, amazing experience, and some small percentage that got food poisoning at the restaurant or had a horrible experience that sent them to the hospital. But what you notice about the distribution of ratings is that it doesn't look anything like a normal distribution. It looks like a J curve, where there are a significant number of 1s, fewer 2s, very few 3s, and a lot of 4s and 5s. And the pathologies of social media explain why you don't see the normal distribution and why you see the J curve. And it has everything to do with how we deal with social media. And my book describes why the J curve arises and how we as brands and businesses have to think about the all-important rating as a determinant of our consumer demand.
When we talk about influence, it is related to attention. So attention is one of the main currencies in the world today. What does it mean to be influential now? And what strategies can help someone to be more influential?
Absolutely. So I have an entire chapter called The Attention Economy, which describes the importance of the attention economy as well as the market structure of an attention economy. And I have multiple entire sections about influence, what it means to be influential, how can we measure influence, what are influentials and what are their role in society, what are their role in business, How can we think about them as a channel of engagement for consumers? And how can influencers think about their own role in the marketplace and in society? And I would say that it is a deep question to think about influence. One of the most important concepts in the hype machine is this notion of what I describe as behavior change. So in one of the very early chapters, I start with the neuroscience of social media, which means what does social media do to your brain? What does your brain look like on social media? So I go into all of the neuroscience studies of people who have been studied, whose brains have been studied while they're using social media to describe how we react mentally to social media, the dopamine reward system, the value system, the mentalizing network, the social brain hypothesis. This is the foundation of understanding influence, because how we receive social signals through social media and how they're interpreted by our brains, and it is the conduit to how we change our behavior through social media messaging. The next step is to understand behavior change itself. So how those brain interpretations result in behavior change. And there, I describe the very important concept of lift, which is this notion of how do we measure behavior change as a function of social media messaging? How can we know whether messages that you deliver over social media are actually changing people's behaviors? And I describe exactly how to do that in the book, but then I also describe how without doing that, you cannot have an accurate estimate of your return on investment from social media, because you don't know what you're getting out of it if you don't know how many purchases or votes or vaccinations or signatures on a petition are actually caused by social media messages. So that is a very deep concept and a very important theme of the book.
Professor, influence and contagion are closely related. A few years ago, you published a study that addressed contagion in sports. Is it possible to influence people in relation to other aspects, such as creativity, for example?
Yeah, so we are discovering new ways in which social media is creating behavioral contagion around the world. We haven't done all the studies necessary to know whether it affects creativity, for example, or other behaviors, but I have an entire chapter in the book called Hypersocialization, which is all about this concept of contagion mediated by social media. And what we do know is that it affects our exercise behaviors. Like you described, we had a very large 5-year study with millions of people in it about exercise. It affects our dating and love life. In 2013, dating relationships introduced by algorithms on social media and dating apps surpassed traditional methods of introduction like friends of friends or family in terms of the fraction of relationships that were introduced by either algorithms or people. And that happened in 2013. And so there are a number of different dimensions, pro-social behavior, charitable giving, in which contagion happens, and we've documented it in experimental studies, and all of that is covered in the chapter on hypersocialization. But if you narrow in on just one, say dating, it really opens up a whole new worldview for you, because if dating is now much more determined by these algorithms than it is by our traditional socialization mechanisms, then what is the impact of social media on human evolution? Because the gene pool and the mixing of genes is now through dating, marriage, relationships, and having children being more determined by algorithms than by the traditional methods of finding a mate that existed for millennia. And that just happened in 2013. What are the impacts on human evolution? That's also in the book.
So we have talked about quality marketing and the way that social networks are changing almost everything. And I have asked you about creativity because I'm especially curious about this subject. Do you think that it's all about a formula? Of course, these algorithms control almost everything, but in this it is all about this AI's formula, or does creativity still have a special role in this scenario? How do you see creativity in the landscape of social networks?
Well, let me comment on this notion about the algorithms control everything. So at the center of the book is a description of a process I call the hype loop, which is actually the main process that determines the outcomes we see as a result of social media. And half of that hype loop is the technology, the machine, the algorithms. But the other half of the loop is human beings. And these two decision makers in tandem together create the world that we live in. And I describe through the course of an entire chapter how the hype loop is manifest in our world with social media in it, how the algorithms sense and suggest new alternatives to us, and how we consume and act on those suggestions, and how this dynamic process creates the outcomes that we see. My guess is that this applies very directly to creativity, although I haven't seen any experimental studies on creativity specifically. All of the research that I've done suggests that this hype loop and this combination of humans and machines in an ever-evolving loop of algorithmic suggestions and human consumption and action based on those suggestions is really the driving engine of the new social age.
Professor, one last question. Is there any other special thought you'd like to put on the table, or anything else about your book, The Hype Machine?
Yeah, I think one really important lesson or thought is that we are now at a crossroads. We're at a crossroads between free speech on one hand and hate speech on the other, between democracy on one hand and authoritarianism on the other, between truth and falsity, between privacy and a lack of privacy. And what happens in the next 18 to 24 months in terms of government regulation, platform policy, social norms about using social media, about business models and how we use the business of social media is going to determine in large part the world that we live in. And so right now, as we speak, countries around the world are trying to think about what to do with social media. Governments are thinking about regulation. We just had an antitrust hearing here in the United States. Should we break up Facebook? Just last week. And many other regulations on privacy and fake news are coming about every day. So we are teetering at the crossroads between two very different realities. And what we do in the next 18 to 24 months is going to be critical to what happens next. And I hope this book can help guide us toward the promise and away from the peril. The main sort of mission or thesis of this book is that social media holds the promise for tremendous positive potential, but also tremendous peril. And we can, and we should, and we must steer it towards the promise and away from the peril. And the book describes how I think we can do that.
Professor Sinan Aral, Director of the Initiative on the Digital Economy, thank you so much for being here.